Hello and welcome everyone to the first in our Innovation to Impact series, which has been brought to you by the York Policy Engine and the York Environmental Sustainability Institute. This is a new series of seminars that will focus on various policy-related topics, showing best practice and information from across the university and showcasing some of the work taking place. I'll introduce the panel in just a moment, but before I do, there are a couple of housekeepings to mention. One, you can turn captions on and off by using the live caption tool at the bottom of your screen. This session is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. If you're watching the recorded version, please note you will not be able to submit questions. There will be two presentations to start us off, and this will be followed by an interactive panel session before opening up for a Q&A from our audience. Please use the Q&A function throughout the session to raise any questions, some of which may be incorporated into the session. If not, we'll aim to pick these up during the live Q&A part at the end. And finally, if you do have any technical questions, please also add these to the Q&A box and we will pick these up as soon as possible. So now I would like to introduce the panel to you. Our first presentation and panellist will be delivered by Professor Tony Heron from the Department of Politics. Tony is currently undertaking a remote fellowship with the International Trade Select Committee. Our second panellist and presenter is Dr. Catherine Wright from York Law School. Catherine completed a post-fellowship in 2018 working with the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee. And finally, I'm delighted to welcome Ben Roberts, who is currently studying for a PhD in interdisciplinary biomedical research at the University of Warwick. Ben recently completed a 3-month post-fellowship funded by the MRC, and Ben will be chairing our session. So thank you so much to Ben for joining us today. The only thing left for me to do is to ask Tony to turn his video on and ask him to kick off the session.
Okay, thanks, Josie. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to share my screen and I have a presentation to follow. Okay, so yes, Josie was saying I'm sort of just over halfway through post-fellowship with the International Trade Committee. I started in March of last year. I literally did 1 week in London before the lockdown, and since then I've been working remotely, as have all the team and most of the MPs up until very, very recently. Last year I did 2 days a week, and this year I've gone up to 3. So I'm working 3 days, 0.6 on the project. So I'll say a couple of things, sort of general things, and I'll maybe talk a little bit more about my experience. But I suppose the first thing I'd say, those of you who are thinking about applying for post fellowships, there are 2 schemes. I believe there's what's called a project, essentially, where you apply with your own kind of idea about what you want to focus on in the fellowship, and then there's a direct call, which generally is where the vacancy is already defined, and that was my case with ITC. And my sense is, from working in Parliament over the last year or so, there's a real issue of capacity shortage, and basically I just don't have enough staff, particularly kind of on the technical kind of expertise side. There's a high staff turnover. So there's a real demand for people who can come in and help. And essentially it's kind of free labor for them. So it's a no-brainer. But the reason I'm saying this, I think, in terms of you thinking about applying, then it seems to me that this kind of scheme has been tremendously successful. And there's a lot of appetite, I think, across Parliament and government more generally to increase, the opportunities for this kind of knowledge exchange. And the third sort of general point I'd make is that 5 years ago, if I'd seen an email about doing an internship or a fellowship or a secondment, I just wouldn't have gone anywhere near it. I thought, well, why would you do that? It's just going to absolutely kill your research time. And it was actually only through a former PhD student of mine who preceded me in the ITC, and he spoke very highly of it. And then I more or less randomly applied, and I was successful. And I have to say, it's one of the best things I've done in my career. And, I think those of you who are thinking about applying but are worried about the knock-on effects for your workload and your research and everything else you're expected to do as an academic, I just think you've just got to adopt a different mindset. And that my experience is for someone who hasn't really done that much public engagement up until the last few years, it's been a great experience. So anyway, I'll say a little bit more about my fellowship. So just so you know, in terms of what I do, as Josie says, I work in the politics department. So I specialize in international trade, issues around governance and regulation, private standards, a particular interest in food and agri-food. And so I was relatively well qualified for the ITC fellowship when that was advertised. So they were basically looking for someone with a background in trade policy, who could fit into their team, which had been established in 2016, along with the new Department for International Trade, which remember was established by Theresa May, which when essentially they separated out the negotiations with the EU, which were at that point led through DX, and then the negotiations with the rest of the world, which was the mandate for the Department for International Trade. And so effectively since 2016, what the ITC committee has been doing has been scrutinizing and overseeing the work of DIT, and that's intensified, particularly since the end of the transition period, where we've now entered a period where the UK government is actually negotiating country trade agreements for the first time as an independent trading power. And so, my day-to-day responsibilities, really, there are a few things that you do. You sit alongside, so generally the committees, they'll have one or two policy specialists. They'll have a clerk and second clerk, and they're generally the people, the team leaders. And then you'll have various other people who might work across a number of different committees on communications, media work, that kind of thing, technical support. And you just sort of sit in. There's no real defined hierarchy, or certainly not in my experience. And you're doing informal, formal training, producing what are called policy briefs. Essentially, is a sort of relatively short document of questions and notes that the MPs can read to make themselves look clever when they're doing the scrutiny. You're advising committee on future inquiries, witnesses, and then ultimately committee report on the basis of the hearings that you carry out. And I found also that when I've been in post, there's quite a few of the other committees have reached out to me to ask me, for help, and in terms of the EFRA committee, the House of Lords International Agreements Committee, one or two others. So you do you are utilised across that. But ultimately, you're part of a team. The work schedule is quite intense. There's a rhythm to the week. You start writing a brief on a Tuesday. You have to circulate that the following Monday, and then you start the cycle over again. And it's only now, while Parliament is in recess, that you really catch a break. I just thought in the few minutes I've got, I'd maybe just point to a few observations and lessons of my experience. As I said at the beginning, I wouldn't say I'm a particularly kind of, someone who's focused that much on public engagement over my career generally, but, I found this to be a really positive experience. Impact of COVID, obviously, that has had knock-on effects for it's fair to say, when I started the fellowship, I had a lot of anxiety around, commuting to London, staying over, how I was going to balance that with family life and so on. And so COVID, in a way, has made that a lot easier. But it does mean I've missed out a lot on the networking opportunities by, being physically present in Parliament, being in the building. So you do miss out, I think, but it's certainly a more efficient way of doing it. And so what's happening now, there is a review across the civil service over the next 18 months. There's trialing remote working, and basically anyone who wants to work remotely can do so. And so I think with a lot of businesses actually the same. It's, you are seeing this more or less permanent shift towards more flexible remote working. And I think it's really good. I mean, the MPs are less keen on it, and they want to be in Parliament a bit more, so there's a bit more pressure on that. But yeah, that's been fine, and I think it does make it much more feasible, I think, to do a fellowship if obviously you've got family commitments or other reasons you might struggle to be physically based in London for a couple of days a week. Issues around time management are really important. I think it is not like doing a research grant. It is literally a 9-to-5 job. You can't dabble. You've got to really create a firewall between your time on the fellowship and your university work, whether that's if you're a PhD student or if you're a full-time academic. I think in the first year I was accepting a lot of calendar invites on the days that I was supposed to be doing my fellowship, and very quickly became unmanageable. So my advice would, if you do get to that stage, you've got to be really strict about how you manage your time. I mentioned earlier that the intensity of the work. I mean, the quality of the work is not, it's not what we as academics and research students that we're used to. But actually, the time you have to actually produce the work, you can't reflect on it. You just have to do it, as it were. It's a very different rhythm of working. If you're used to being, in a university environment where you have more time to consider, what the things that you're producing. If you're like me, a bit of a perfectionist, I always agonize about whether I've got everything right. You just don't have time for that. And that is a real adjustment. And I found that a real adjustment, as I did with the issues around political neutrality. It's a really, really, even more of an issue than I was anticipating. I think, Brexit hasn't helped, because that's in a way is the prism through which a lot of policy and politics gets deliberated in Parliament at the moment. But even amongst the staff, I've been reprimanded once or twice. I'm not a particularly political person, I wouldn't say, but just for phrasing things in the wrong way. And even when you're writing the documents for the MPs, you as academics, we're trained to infer. You have the evidence in front of you, and you will say, well, the logical inference of this is, X, Y, Z. You just can't do that, because it looks as though you're making a position or you're making a political claim. So you've always got to kind of refer to an independent source. And that's again, for academics who are used to logical inference as their kind of, the kind of DNA of their skill set. It's a very different etiquette that you have to work around. Going back to the kind of workload management issue, I would say that you really have to talk to your head of department before you apply, because it's not like a research grant where, say, you get 0.6 buyer, which is kind of nominal time. Yeah, in this case, if I'm on a 0.6, I'm on 0.6. That's like 3 days a week. I physically can't do anything else but the fellowship, and obviously there are periods which are more or less busy, and you can eke out some time. But my experience, if you don't get the relief from other university responsibilities, you will end up, it will eat into your leisure time. So it's something you've got to really have that conversation. By the same token, what I'd say in terms of what you do with the limited spare time you have, I think two things that I've done and I'd recommend. One is I've tried to concentrate on outputs and things I wouldn't normally do. So I've got in the habit of writing sort of, blogs and editorials, for the conversation at LSE, Brexit blog, and various things that can be done in a relatively short amount of time, and things you can never really justify, I think, when you're an academic and you're concentrating on the ref and things. And I found that really fun. Typically done one a month, and that's been really good. But also, I've tried to reorient my research around around the fellowship. So I'm now co-authoring a book around the UK's independent trade policy, and I'm able to double up, as it were, in terms of doing research for the committee sessions and inquiries, as well as doing work on my book. And so I've managed to pull those things together, but it's never, it's not a perfect fit, because you have to juggle these things. But yeah, I mean, it's so in sum, I would say my experience has been really positive. I've really enjoyed it, and it is a lot of work, and there are challenges, difficulties with managing the workload, but yeah, I mean, I would definitely recommend it. It's been a great experience for me, and I'm happy to answer any sort of questions that anyone may have in the Q&A afterwards. So I will stop there. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Tony. A really great insight into everything you've been going through over the last year. And really great to hear about kind of how you got to manage your time and the differences in kind of government and academic life. So thanks for sharing that with us. And yeah, like Tony says, if you've got any questions for him, please do pop them in the Q&A. So now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Catherine Wright from the York Law School. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Josie. Hello, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Right, so hello, I'm Catherine Wright. My work is focused on EU law, especially constitutional law, internal market and competition, and regulation. And in my pre-academic life, I worked in the European Parliament in the early 2000s in Brussels and Strasbourg, and in a regional representation in Brussels, so for a UK MEP. And I applied to the fellowship scheme back in 2017, and my fellowship was between January and July 2018. I applied, so Tony mentioned the two different channels, I suppose, that you could get a fellowship, and I applied through the open call, meaning that I had to come up with a project, kind of a pitch, and then see if anyone was interested, really, through the application. The scheme appealed to me because I'm always looking for ways to match up my previous policy experience with my current academic life. And given the timing of my expertise, I was also hoping to make some small contribution in the context of Brexit. And the negotiations were ongoing at that time, and obviously we didn't know at that stage at what point they would actually be concluded, but it was when Theresa May was still Prime Minister. And I think it's important to remember as well, since we're talking about select committees, that they are responsible for scrutinising government policy. So the select committees essentially mirror the government departments and scrutinise them. So that particularly appealed to me as well, to kind of contribute to that process. So that was my project title, Managing Regulatory Divergence in the UK's Future Trade Arrangements with the EU. That wasn't actually my original pitch. My original one was narrower, on the UK's relationship with EU regulatory agencies, especially economic regulatory agencies and networks. And actually that had come off the back of a research grant application, which I didn't get. So I was also trying to recycle all the work that I'd done for that grant and join up different things that I was doing to try and get something out of that. So more detail will no doubt come out in our panel discussion and the Q&A, but for this short intro, I'll just concentrate on what I actually did during the fellowship and also some advice, particularly on the application process. So I was doing some of the similar things to what Tony was doing. I was suggesting particular lines of inquiry or questions that could be asked for various evidence sessions. So there were, the very first week I was there was an evidence session with a pro-Brexit think tank. So we had to do a briefing for the MPs there. And I would say as well that this really surprised me, because I'd been told, or I'd got the impression that you had to do things that were very short. For example, you need 2 sides for MPs or someone who is more in a policy background. But actually, these briefings were 60 pages long. I think it might differ from committee to committee. But essentially, the MPs like to have a sort of pick and mix of different sources. So you had different ways of presenting information. Some stuff would be from newspapers or other think tanks, or there'd be graphs or charts or whatever. So that was the first thing that really surprised me, was that there was actually quite a lot of work that went into producing the briefing, although it was very much pull everything together and throw it in. As Tony said, it wasn't peer-reviewed stuff or anything like that. And I think that's one contribution that academics can make, is to try and raise the level of the evidence, really. And another problem is, of course, that Parliament or committees don't necessarily have subscriptions to journals and all that kind of thing. And it's way too long for them to read anyway. So pulling things from different sources was important. I also contributed to the committee sectoral reports. So they were doing an inquiry on Brexit and the implications of British business. And within that, they've chosen these particularly important or priority sectors in the automotive industry, aerospace, processed food and drink, and pharmaceuticals, none of which were my specialist subject at all when I started, but it was basically applying things to those areas. I also reviewed the draft reports and viability of particular recommendations with reference to EU law. So that was more of a sense check, so that they weren't suggesting something which actually couldn't be done. I was asked at various points to respond to specific questions on EU law or trade, and producing various internal written briefings. So that's something else we could talk about, as well as the fact that a lot of the work is behind the scenes, and not everything you do is necessarily that visible in terms of output. So that's a balance to make. I also joined the Brexit scrutiny group on trade. So that was bringing together Commons and Lords committee staff, and also the library staff. And the idea was that they would share what they were working on. They could join up what they were doing and kind of help each other in their work. And then the main output from my 6-month placement with them was this detailed paper on different understandings of mutual recognition. So I'd been asked to put this thing together, quite a long briefing for the committee and staff, which I shared internally, and it was taken up by a lot of the other committees as well as a kind of background document. And then I was asked to revise it, and it was published as a Commons Library paper, and had 700 unique views in the first couple of weeks that it was out, and over 200 downloads. So that really boosted visibility of what I was doing. And the idea of that was that at the time Theresa May was talking about having a comprehensive system of mutual recognition. That was government policy towards Brexit. And I was sort of, again, trying to do a reality check of how that wouldn't necessarily work. So I was physically based in London. I was very lucky, as I thought at the time, but also even more so now. I was based in London for 2 or 3 days a week with the committee staff, with the team of about 6 people. And because I was physically there, I was introduced to people from the other committees, because they work, or they did, and hopefully will again, in an open plan office situation where you have library and committees that are working on similar areas kind of grouped together on the floors of the building. So that was really helpful to keep my ears open and find out what was going on in other committees and to get involved in other things. And yeah, I should also say that as I was with the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee, obviously its main focus was not Brexit, actually. I mean, there are other committees that were more squarely focused on that, like the Brexit Committee and the European Scrutiny Committee. And so there were other things they were doing at the time, like the collapse of Carillion and the gender pay gap report. So sometimes I was kind of a bit, working on my own on these reports and then occasionally contributing to things, but other members of the team might be working on totally different stuff. So that was something else about my experience there. In terms of advice, I'd agree with everything that Tony said about actually doing the fellowship. In terms of applying and thinking about applying, I would say it's important to think broadly about your expertise. So often as academics, we have to define our specialisms quite narrowly, but this is actually the opposite situation. And I found myself learning quite a lot on various topics because they were, kind of next to ones that I was doing. So that was also helpful in terms of expanding my own knowledge. But think about what you can offer more broadly around your core area of expertise. Maybe think about Venn diagrams of topics. And then in terms of suggesting a topic, if you're going for this open call, horizon scanning is important. So coming from your own perspective, are there any practical or policy issues that are coming up in your field? And then from the Parliament angle, you can do research on, are there any government white papers? Are there any issues that are coming up in parliamentary debates? So you can see debates on the Parliament website. There are transcripts, there's Hansard, which reports everything that's discussed in Parliament. Just thinking about things that are on the agenda or that you think should be on the agenda that aren't being picked up. I would say to have a defined project, but be prepared to be flexible. I certainly found that both in the application process through the 2 rounds of the process and also while I was doing the fellowship. And obviously highlight any previous policy or public engagement experience you have, or any experience of non-academic writing or, shorter pieces of writing, because all of that is going to help. I didn't get the impression that seniority in terms of career was that important, actually, as long as you know your topic and you could contribute something, then it was very welcome. There wasn't really a hierarchy in that sense. So in terms of further information, Wright here at the university did a little policy briefing on my project, so that's there if you wanted to look at that. I've given a link to my library briefing paper in case you want to look at what the summary would look like, or a wider document, a wider library briefing. And that is my email address in case anyone would like to get in touch later directly with me, but obviously we'll also talk now, and there's the Q&A.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Catherine. Great to hear kind of the contrast between yourself and Tony's experience as well, because obviously you both kind of gone through similar experiences, but having to do one remotely and one in person. So interesting to hear, and hope we get a bit more from that during the panel session. If I could now invite Tony to turn on his video as well, I'll hand over to Ben, who's going to lead our panel session. So thanks, Ben.
Yes, thank you both for interesting talks to start. I'm going to work through some of the discussion points first from the form that was sent out. Catherine, you touched on this, so I'll go to Tony first, but what was it that made you decide to apply for this post-fellowship?
In my case, it was purely by chance that I had a former student who'd done the fellowship, and we got talking about it, and he recommended it. But I think I was, in my experience, was quite different to Catherine's, because actually it was more or less the if you like, the job spec was pretty much what I did, because I'd for sort of a good part of 20 years I'd worked on trade in various areas, so I had quite broad knowledge, and so the fit was quite good. I mean, incidentally, I think Catherine's absolutely right. I don't think seniority is an issue at all. I think they want people who are generalists, I think. And so I was, there was a lot of serendipity involved in my case. One thing I would say, in addition to what Catherine was saying about things you can do, prior to applying, one of the things I would recommend is, if you're not already active in terms of writing for public audiences through, the conversation or blogs or whatever, do it, because that's the one thing they want to see, that you can write for lay audiences, and that's a big part of the job. If you turn up with strong academic credentials, but actually you've never written anything less than 8,000 words, then it's a very practical thing you can do in the interview, because you get through to that stage, they'll want to know that you can do that. So that's just another thing to add to all the things that Catherine was mentioning, which I totally agree with.
Catherine, was there anything else that sort of drove you to apply for this either as well?
Just what I mentioned, really. I mean, as an EU lawyer, as a UK-based EU lawyer, Brexit, has also had career impact as well as all the other things, and kind of affecting my own identity and everything. So it's very, very difficult to write anything academic during that time anyway, because the goalposts were moving so much. It was very frustrating, and so it was really good to have the opportunity to write other types of things, shorter things that don't have to stand the test of time 10 years later. And I really wanted to try and be useful, because I felt, to be honest, quite helpless myself after all that. So I really wanted to contribute, if I could, to understanding EU law in the UK and the implications for Brexit and all of that.
Great. So Tony just touched on this, but did either of you have prior experience in either policy or public engagement more widely, and what sort of things did you do?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
I mean, historically, I hadn't really. I'd been very much a kind of, the kind of typical and lonely scholar model. But I think when I moved to York in 2012, I'd started to do more interdisciplinary work, and I kind of rode off the coattails of other people and was doing a bit more, and I kind of led me in that direction. But I hadn't really done anything, as committing as this, really. So, and they, that didn't really, I don't think that came up as an issue in terms of, the application process. But I think it's obviously a good idea if you can, you can get experience of doing it, and I think what Catherine was saying is right. I think academia is changing away, and I think thinking more fully about the role of an academic in terms of public life, I think that's changing as well. And and it's been, I personally, for me, I think even when I finish, I don't think I'll go back to that. I think it's something I have really enjoyed doing, and but I didn't, I was a relative novice really when it came to it, and so it's, you are in at the deep end. But not only that, I think the other thing you have to bear in mind is, as academics become highly institutionalized to a certain way of working, and then you're dropped into a kind of completely different set of kind of institutional dynamics, in terms of teamwork, in terms of line management. It's completely different, and and there's no real induction or anything. You just basically day one that you just have to fit in the team. And the other thing I would say as well, and I think the committees are very different. I think the chairing of the committees can have an important bearing. Also the demographics of the committee. So like ITCs are relatively young. The team are relatively young. But there's no real seniority in terms of what you do. Again, Catherine's experience might be different, but I felt like when I first started, I'd be like, doing the kind of high level technical input, but I was spending a lot of time just writing and culling information from newspaper articles and just doing things that everyone else in the team was doing. And that's very different actually to being an academic, I think. And so it is, the work environment is a very different one, but it's some ways that's what I think is part of the appeal. It's actually, it's a sort of almost as a relief to work in a different kind of way. Particularly someone like me who, I came through. So unlike Catherine, I hadn't really had any sort of, employment experience outside of academia.
Great, thank you. Catherine, had you done much before?
Well, as I mentioned, on the EU policy side I had, but not so much on the UK side. So I did teach UK constitutional law, so I knew something about the conventions and rules in theory in Parliament, but it was interesting to see that in practice. I'd also because I also previously worked in Centre for Competition Policy, so it was academic centre, but also had, as the name suggests, a lot of policy events. And I'd done some commissioned research for the UK Department for Business there as part of a team, just a small thing. And so I worked a bit with civil servants. I have friends who were civil servants, but not really directly on the UK side of things. But as Tony was saying, the culture of it was very much more team-based and just get stuck into it, really.
Had you had to do many public engagement events and things like that at this previous place then?
I did not in the European Parliament. I was more kind of on the staff of the MEP, but yes, in my, I was a research associate there, and it was while I was doing my PhD. So we did some things like that, but to be honest, I was more on the academic presentation side of things.
Okay, so obviously Tony's just mentioned there that he thinks it's sort of maybe changed his outlook from the lonely scholar. I think he said, or something around that. I was wondering if you, Catherine, if you feel like having done the fellowship has changed the way that you approach your work now. I'd done a fair bit of interdisciplinary stuff as well, and actually that was one of the things I found really energizing, although because I thought, I have to go down to London every week, that might be quite tiring on the train, but actually I found it really energizing to be around people working together like that. But in terms of my own work, I think I'm more likely to get involved with just writing a bit here and there. We've also off the back of that, I was asked to apply for this Welsh Senate Brexit advice framework agreement that the university is now part of. So it already led on to some other quite substantial policy engagement work elsewhere. And I think I might be more likely to contribute evidence, in terms of written evidence, to committees as well, which I was less sure about before. I'd occasionally done that more on EU policy consultations, but I think I'd be more likely to do that now. And following that, is what would you guys think? What is the culture of the policy-led department like? How did you find that while you were working?
Well, it's a really strong public service ethos. I mean, yeah, I think everyone was really at a high level. They're really thinking about working towards a functioning parliamentary democracy. This was before the prorogation of Parliament and all of that, which I think really hit some stuff hard from what I could tell. Yeah, and as Tony mentioned before, political neutrality is really important. I mean, you get a sense of what people's views are, but you have to be very careful about that and how you express that. Yeah, so there's this importance of parliamentary democracy, basically. And I mentioned as well that it's quite a collegial way of working. I mean, physically, they were working in an open plan office. There'd be some committee specialists who I found that they would rotate quite a lot as well. Although they were committee specialists, that didn't somehow mean they were necessarily specialists to that committee topic, strangely. There was quite a lot of rotation of staff and bringing in. So at one point, someone came from the Treasury Select Committee to help out on a report. So there's pulling in of staff from different committees and library sections. So that was very collegial as well. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of engagement with current affairs. So I found that really you had to be listening to the Today programme on Radio 4 and the FT before you went in, otherwise you were a bit lost first thing in the morning. Quite often the TVs would be on watching the debates as well in the Commons chamber. So that was my impression of it.
Tony, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I did a similar experience. I think that the composition of the committee does make a difference. So with ITC, we have Angus McNeill, who's SNP. So he's the chair. He's the only SNP chair. And so obviously you have a majority Conservative grouping on the committee. And I think the dynamics are, because I think the chair in some ways is politically isolated. And I think that does affect the conduct of the committee. And so I think, so I compare it with the committee I know best is the committee has scrutinised the work of DEFRA, where you have a Conservative chair, but also who's someone strongly independently minded. And I think my judgment is that committee has done a better job of scrutinising the government than ITC has, just because the political dynamics are different. The other thing I'd say is what I've heard. I mean, I've found that actually with my committee, when I've come up with, suggestions for academic witnesses, they're generally being quite supportive. Although there is this tendency, I think, I sort of personally blame Twitter for this, that there's a sort of what we call frequent flyers, that these people who basically float around the policy world and never really do anything other than, write on Twitter. And they're always the people that the committee staff want to invite. And so you have to really make an argument to say, actually, well, this person has been working in this area for 20 years, has much more authority. And so that's a culture, I think, about academics. And I know I have a friend who is with the International Affairs Unit, where there is a strong kind of hostility towards academic witnesses. And I think he told me for 2 years, they hadn't had an academic witness in any of their select committees. So absolutely, the dynamics do vary between committee, and you have to kind of navigate your way around that.
Okay. So obviously you've both sounded like you've enjoyed the work that you've done so far. I wonder if you could highlight your favourite part of it. Catherine, while you were there, or your favourite part so far, Tony?
That's a good question. I think that, I think the outputs are kind of that's the bit where you do feel like, it's quite gratifying to see your name on the committee reports. And that's good. And I miss being in London. I think the first time I was there, you feel like, you're getting a lot of the insider, how politics really works. But I'd say the other thing that's really is just the intangibles of just, I'd not really studied British politics very much at all in my career. And probably like Catherine, and it's almost like circumstances brought me to it. And but with trade, I mean, it's almost this unique kind of natural experiment type conditions, and actually for political scientists, it's just been amazing just to observe that. But also just you come away with the feeling that the Parliament is so kind of antiquated, and the conduct of the issues around diversity are quite shocking. And to hear how the MPs, even in the public sessions, how they talk is if you used to work in a university environment, it's a really strange culture shock actually. But it's I would say just as a political scientist, just being exposed to how politics and how parliamentary scrutiny it works, particularly for ITC, because actually it's been put in this really awkward position that basically it is being presented as the scrutiny function in terms of trade policy, but it doesn't have the capacity or the access to do that job properly. So it's a really politically, it's a really it's a difficult one. But it's, as a observer, it's super interesting to just to be able to take that all in.
Catherine?
Yeah, I think it was, doing something constructive and feeling like I was useful was good. And also I really enjoyed being in London. As I said, I found that really energizing. I also got to go and sit in on other evidence sessions and the Commons Chamber as well. So yeah, I'm a bit of a sucker for that kind of thing. So that was quite exciting, actually, being in the Palace of Westminster when various things were kicking off around that time, and overhearing ministers talking to whoever in the corridors outside select committee evidence sessions was, I was making some notes for my memoirs later.
I think I'm quite similar in that one of my favourite parts was seeing the impact that your work can be actually having on the real world. Academia can sort of be its own little bubble at times, I think. So it was nice to see like a real world impact from work that we're doing.
Actually, Ben, I just thought of something when you were asking about highlights. I had an incident where I hadn't been there very long, and we'd had a public session with Liz Truss around a proposed free trade deal with America, and so we're going through that. And so I had was on kind of WhatsApp chat with the chair, and so he was asking the questions, and the question came up about compensation around NHS, the issue around NHS access for drugs policy around the NHS, which is a kind of key negotiating ask for the Americans, and so the chair was asking the Secretary of State about this, and she sort of said, "Oh, well, it hasn't come up in the negotiations," and I just happened to have the US negotiating mandate on my desk. And I says it's on page 2. So quickly, took a picture of it and sent it over to WhatsApp. And then the chair just asked this question. He says, "Well, it's here." And so it was a real kind of West Wing moment. I thought, it's quite, it's good to do that. But it only had happened once, but it was quite fun to do that.
Oh, that sounds like you couldn't have written that, basically.
Yeah.
So I've noticed that there's quite a few questions coming in on the Q&A, and there is a few pre-submitted questions as well. So I'll move on to them, I think, now. So the first pre-submitted question that we had was, what were your key achievements during your time as a post fellow, and why would you recommend it to your colleagues? Catherine, if you'd like to go first with that.
Yeah, I think we've covered some of that already, but I suppose that that my main public output, that final briefing paper, because it obviously a lot of people read it, or at least read the summary, And yeah, just generally feeling as that I could see that my work was having some impact in particular sessions as well. Yeah, and then what was the second part, and why?
So why would you recommend it to colleagues?
Yeah, I think it just gives you a whole new perspective. I mean, I think it helps with your own research and different types of outputs, and just gives you different perspectives on different applications of your own research as well.
Mm-hmm. Tony?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, I'd say, you know, the risk sounds slightly pompous, at just making a kind of contribution really to to the public good. But if you think about it just more instrumentally and things, because obviously it's a trade-off, and if you do a fellowship, even a relatively short fellowship, it's going to eat into the time you have for other things. So it has to be some sort of career benefit. So it will raise your profile. Opportunity to write for lay audiences is great. In terms of self-confidence, there are lots of spin-offs, but I think also as well, issues around impact. And I think often the conversations around impact it's almost like it's always somebody else's job to do that, and you have to have like unique qualities to be able to have a kind of impact narrative, and maybe at some point be the basis for an impact case study, and there's a select kind of group of people. But actually it's not that difficult to do, and this is just a platform that puts you in the space to be able to do that. You are doing something that is meeting a need in terms of the technical capacity that these committees have for scrutinizing. They don't have many experts, as Catherine says. The policy specialists tend to basically arrive and have literally like weeks to get on top of a huge policy brief, and they might do 2 years there and go off somewhere else. So it's a very impactful role, and then obviously it then allows you to build on that and do other things. So I think there are some sacrifices you have to make to do it, but absolutely it doesn't have to in any way compromise your career your career ambitions. And as I say, I think that the future of academia, I think, at least I hope the future is one where actually these kinds of public goods are more rewarded, and given higher priority in things like the ref, because it's obviously it's what universities are designed to do. So yeah, I mean, I think it's as well as the intangibles, there are concrete kind of career benefits that you can get from doing this, and I certainly feel that's in my case. I've had to do things differently, but I think it's absolutely this. It's a it's a bit of a no-brainer if you're thinking about will this hold me back, or will this improve my career development? And I think the answer is it will. If you're lucky enough to be successful in the competition.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, speaking as a student as well, I've recommended it to a lot of my peers here at Warwick to apply for. It also kind of just opens your eyes a bit as well. I think a lot of PhD students can get stuck in a mindset that you do a PhD, you do a postdoc, you become a supervisor, and you stay in labs, you stay in academia. And I think seeing all these different opportunities and being able to do them for just my placement was 3 months, which luckily was a funded break. Just having the opportunity to do that has really opened my eyes to what other kind of career paths I could go down, and the important role they actually play in society. I mean, obviously we're going to always need scientists in the lab working on things, but actually sort of bringing that out of the lab and onto the shelves, onto the streets and things like that. These roles are insanely important, and I don't think I quite appreciated that until I did this placement. So I think I'd recommend for that reason to any PhDs considering it. or interested in it at all. So the next question was, would you recommend a psychology student applies with the BPS scheme, or would you say other schemes are just as accessible? I study sleep, and therefore I'm wondering how closely I can align my interests in these fellowships. I'm assuming that if, as a student, this would be more similar to the kind of fellowship I did. So when I did mine, it was a 3-month placement. So I didn't actually get to choose the topic I wrote about. They were chosen a few months before I started. So I study the brain and sort of related to sleep things, but I'm doing circadian rhythms. And my topic was living organ donation. So obviously the brain isn't something a living person can donate. So it was well off my topic. And I found that easy. Like they kind of expect that. They're not necessarily hiring PhD students as experts, but as expert researchers. They're definitely skills that we've developed in our time studying. I think some other examples, there was another guy on my, in the year that the time that I did it, that his PhD is in the history of the NHS and hospitals. And he was writing about childhood obesity. So it's not necessarily about being an expert in that field. So I think you wouldn't have to worry about your area of research being too far out for a placement, or not specific enough for something that they're currently looking into. I don't know if either of you two would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think in terms of the post placements, like the PhD placements, I think that they're quite different. I mean, I've had experience of that because through NA Agri-Food, we were involved in pitching ideas. So it might even be in the childhood obesity might have been one of them, but we basically put forward some ideas, and they, and post decided which ones they wanted to use. And I think and they will mold them to their own kind of preferences. But I think I think the fit in is obviously, because if you're the fit between for the PhD scheme, I think is different. I think you're right, Ben. I don't get the sense that actually they're looking so much at what you're writing about is you're slap bang in the middle of your research project. It's just the ability to come in and work on a project and be able to deliver the post note. So I would say that's probably unlike, say, what Catherine and I did, where it was a very especially mine, it was all was set up in such a way that if you weren't a trade expert, you wouldn't apply. But I think the post internship scheme is a bit more inclusive.
Okay. The final, I think, pre-submitted question is someone that they're currently putting together an application for a PhD via the NIHR fellowship route. Whilst pulling this together, my PhD proposal, is there anything I should include or consider now that would be a more suitable candidate for a post fellowship? I'd say, following on from kind of what I've just said, that the PhD placements aren't necessarily based around your topic, but I'd say as a tip, learn how to explain your topic well to a public audience. I think that's a skill that they're really looking for when they're taking on fellows. I think the number is definitely increasing, but the number of MPs that have even I think it's A-level science and things like that is surprisingly low. It's certainly getting better, but the ability to take like these complex scientific principles and things and then explain them so they understand them, and not only do they understand them, they want to understand them. They need to kind of explain to them why this is important and why they need to know about it. Being able to talk about your research in the same way and practice doing that, I think would be vital for you. So I'd tell you to bear that in mind, but I don't think you need to change any part of your research or anything like that in order to apply. Again, I don't know if this is something Tony and Catherine want to comment on, with it being quite a different sort of fellowship approach.
Yeah,
if not, I think we should move on to the Q&As that have been asked throughout the session. So I'll just work through them. So Carl asked, did you or were you allowed to draw on your existing networks in putting together briefings? I have placement coming up in September, and I'm thinking that there might be areas where I know someone who is the subject expert on a very niche issue. Would I be allowed to consult them?
My sense is yes, but the etiquette of the committee, so with ITC, sometimes we do private briefings. So if you've got there's like a go-to person on a particular subject, they might hold a sort of private briefing where that person can present in a short session. But they're more uncommon. Usually it's a public session. And so you have to persuade the clerk that this person, was suitable and appropriate. And going back to the neutrality point as well, I think that sometimes comes up. I don't think in my experience, they don't quite like you to be just drawing on your own kind of network. And then you've got to try and balance that off. Catherine would have experienced this as well, is that it's got less so, but it got quite tiresome where you would have to try and find, somebody from the Adam Smith Institute or the Institute for Economic Affairs or, Centre for Policy Studies, to balance that. And you'd put these like heavyweight academics who've been studying like trade policy for 30 years against some 23-year-old, straight out of uni. But that's just the nature of, it's a very political role. So yeah, I think if you have, people in your networks, you can, and that's precisely what you're there for, is a kind of conduit for allowing committees to access that kind of scientific expertise. But there's a certain etiquette about how you go about it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's the sort of thing where you might suggest their name to the clerk or committee specialist, and then they might get in touch with them, from what I saw in the committee.
I found when I was writing my post note so there wasn't actually anyone that I knew off the bat, but even when it comes to specific areas, I think getting multiple people, just talking to multiple people or getting multiple people's opinions is always good. People might not always realize it, but they might have some agenda or some bias that you wouldn't pick up on, especially if you're not fully into that sort of area at the time. So I don't see it as an issue if you already know someone that might be helpful, but I would kind of supplement it with a few others that you don't know, as they might give you a different opinion or a different perspective on a certain topic. So the next question is from Rambir, and they ask, are authors of post notes and post briefs always academics from fellowships, or have they been written in the past by parliamentary staff? I attended a policy masterclass by the Open Innovation team, and they alluded to the briefings and expertise delivered by the same experts again and again. So I found when I was writing my post note that they take on quite a few PhD students in fellowships to write them, but then there is a small in-house team at Post. They have like a life science advisor, energy advisor, and they'll constantly be working on these post notes as well, whilst also helping the fellows. So I do think they have some people that will constantly get them, but I found that they definitely relied on the number of PhDs to help them get the number of post notes out. I don't know how it quite works for briefs, as they were the ones that were more academic led. So I'll pass that over to Tony.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's with some committees. So as well as like post fellows, you have specialist advisors as well. So people who are paid, basically do what Catherine and I do, but they're paid on an hourly rate. and they're often brought in for particular inquiries, and sometimes they will produce that. But yeah, I mean, the briefs we produce are for internal use only, so they're not for, they're just for the MPs. And then obviously what comes out of that are the committee reports, and they generally are written by the committee staff, and then the MPs will read and offer comments, and the level of engagement is does vary. But it's a combination of the committee staff and the fellows and specialist advisors if they're on the committees as well.
Okay, so the next one, I think this was asked by Claire for you, Tony, was when you were full-time on the fellowship days, was that because you were in meetings all day with the Parliament team, or is that just the time you needed for the amount of work?
That's a good question. Yeah, so generally Wednesdays are a day where you are, that's when usually you'll have the public session, you'll have a private meeting beforehand, and in the morning you'll be having maybe a team meeting. So when I initially was negotiating around this, it was that was the bottom line. You would have to be physically present on Wednesday because that's the meeting day. And then in terms of the rest of it, that was more my design, because we particularly when I went up to 3 days, it was trying to work out what was the best. And so it's just a way of creating that firewall with your other time, and I think it's important as well if you're thinking about, if you're doing it on a kind of, fractional basis, and then you're teaching, if you don't bracket that time off, and then we can get really chaotic. So I got to a point where, I was able to put a, teaching restrictions form in. I could teach Monday or Friday. I can't teach the other days. There was no reason for it to be like that, other than that I would know that would be that my ITC time, and as I was saying in my presentation, I think that's really quite important, just to stay on top of it, because it is easy, I think, to basically slip in the fact where you can do academic work during that. And I think sometimes working from home is harder. I think, I imagine in Catherine's case, and as I know my predecessor at ITC, because you're physically there, you're in the office, a lot of the things you're now having to do over Zoom are it's just more efficient, so you're involved, so you don't need to worry about, you just don't have time to think about anything else. But when you're at home, you've always got the temptation that you've got, outstanding bit of work, or you've got emails from colleagues that need following up. And so just being able to say, actually, these are the days, my fellowship, and I'm going to treat this as my job, is, it might not work for everyone, but I found that was really important. But it was a lesson I came to after a while. I didn't just, on day one decide that's how I was going to do it. And I would definitely recommend, if you are thinking about, doing a fellowship and you are lucky enough to be successful, that you're able to do it like that, not treat it like a grant, because it's not. It's the nature of the work and the commitment. The work is not necessarily as intellectually taxing, but actually just in terms of getting the stuff out, getting the reports and the briefs done, it does require an effort, and just it is very time consuming. So I think it is really important actually to have that sort of demarcation between your post role and your day job.
In a similar theme, another question that came in for you, Catherine, was asking about when you were commuting to London, what were your hours like?
I think I guess I was physically there about 2.5 days a week. So I would go down in the morning one day and then arrive for sort of late morning lunchtime, maybe do a bit on the train, and then be there the next 2 days and then leave. So, but it was not incredibly long hours. It was, maybe not quite 9 to 5, might be a bit before 9 and then till 6 or 6:30 or something. Not every week though, because as I was saying, I was occasionally the other team members were working on other inquiries or things like that. So sometimes I was a bit more getting on with my own thing. One other thing we haven't mentioned actually is security clearance. And I had, I'm not sure if Tony has this, obviously, because he's working remotely. I had a Parliament laptop, which I had to use for Parliament work. So that obviously helped the separation, but also meant that there were certain things I couldn't do on the train. I mean, I could obviously look up various publicly available stuff on the internet on my way down on the train on my own laptop. So there was that to consider as well, which also meant that I was wheeling around 2 laptops all the time.
Okay. So then Veronica has asked if the fellowship is also open to postdocs, and is the application process different or more difficult if one is not a UK citizen? If it's for the sort of PhD student fellowship, when I've seen them advertised, they tend to be advertised for final year PhDs or people who have just finished. I think that just finished might be around up to a year. I can't say for certain. But it would be worth looking on an advert next time they post one. And I would say as well, I don't think they pick just UK citizens. I think any applicant that is a good enough candidate would get it. I don't think they're that fussed. Like I said, the security clearance and things like that, you just as long as you can fill out all of your family and things like that, and they can all be checked out. I think you should be fine. I don't know if I'm guessing that's the same experience for Tony and Catherine, that they probably agree with that.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that you have a contract with a UK institution that's involved or that's eligible for the scheme, which you obviously are at York. So that's my understanding of it. But I don't think there's any difference whether you're a UK citizen or not.
Good. So Leanne asks that you seem to have a good working knowledge of parliamentary structure and politics. Was this the case before you applied for the fellowship? And was this tested in interview?
Despite teaching politics for 20 years, I knew virtually nothing about because I studied international trade, so there was no, the UK was, all the major decisions were devolved to the European Commission, so there was no need to study it, and so no, I didn't really have any kind of knowledge of Parliament or select committees, and that in my interview didn't come up at all. They were just interested in what I knew, whether I they're interested in my knowledge, breadth of my knowledge, because they want, I think, as Catherine again was saying, they want the breadth, because you can't just go in and say, I'm a law specialist in competition law. You've got to be able to think, well, actually, the committee will be looking at all sorts of different questions. So the broader your knowledge base, or that you will have the translation skills, and I think that's important. I think that's certainly when I was interviewed, that was my kind of pitch, that because I'd kind of, I didn't really have a strong disciplinary identity. I was able to see, I can understand some of the law, understand the economics. So that's much more important. That the issue about knowledge of Parliament just did not come up at all in my experience.
Yeah, that didn't come up in my interview either. They were just interested in what I'd proposed, maybe trying to mould that a bit to what they needed. And I think as well, as part of the application, we had to give a sample of non-academic writing as well. But yeah, they weren't worried about whether you understood various things about Parliament. And you can pick up quite a lot of that once you get going as well.
I was the same, similar. I don't think I had as deeper knowledge as maybe probably should have had going into it, but I certainly do now. It wasn't something that came up in the interview. I think I said that I knew that there was someone called Boris in charge, and that was about it. But yeah, no, I don't think they're there to test you on that. I think they're more, the interviews are more to test that you can communicate science and topics well, basically. The one thing I did sort of learn, and I'm very thankful for the placement for, is learning more about sort of what everything else that goes on in Westminster and around Parliament. So things like all party parliamentary groups, that are these like weekly sessions where people like debate and discuss a huge range of different topics. I certainly learned there was a lot more going on than I thought, and like the roles of MPs and things like that. So it was more of a learning experience as opposed to going in with that knowledge already. Yeah, and then I think this might be the final question that we have from the Q&A session, and this is from Claire. So for both, on your return to academic life, how have you managed publishing the material from the fellowship in terms of restrictions on material, and how have you managed the ref pressure given the materials produced are not generally academic in nature?
So in my case, yeah, it's a good question. So I'm writing a book on the UK's independent trade policy, and so I have discussed it with the clerk, and just to be upfront, with the most of the committee's work, certainly in my experience, is on the public record. You do have private briefings, but I mean, they're, in my view, they're worse than useless, because the code of the civil service, particularly, you know, the ministerial kind of, you know, the undersecretaries, they're just briefed and instructed not to give stuff away. So you never really get much out of those private sessions. So most of the information in my policy sphere is in the public domain. And so I'd say the real value is not so much you getting insider knowledge as much. You get some insights, I guess, but it's mainly allows you to specialize. Yeah. So in my case, you know, that actually, I mean, the internship, the fellowship came first and the book idea came second. But it just allows you to double up and, you know, make sure that the things you're researching for your fellowship, then you can utilize. But the other thing is, I said, you know, maybe it's a seniority thing, but I feel like with the ref, you know, that I do think academia is changing. I think, you know, some of the disciplinary boundaries are breaking down. I think the norm around public engagement, your knowledge exchange is becoming stronger, and you know, and I feel that for me, that's, you know, that's what I want to do when I return to academia, is to actually not, you know, count this as, you know, as like as a sort of temporary secondment, but actually, you know, it does. I think it just opens your eyes to, it is possible to be, you know, an academic and fulfill your obligations to things like the ref, but also to, you know, to be, you know, to be a sort of, to contribute to the public, to do public engagement, to write for lay audiences, you know, and I think that there are times to do that. And I think during the fellowship, you haven't got time to be working articles, but you can write, you know, blogs and things. And then the time you finish is when you can reflect on, and then maybe then go back to the academic publication. So yeah, it's, you know, it's obviously it's more work, but yeah, I think, as I said right at the beginning, it's, in my experience, it's been a real, you know, sort of positive experience.
Yeah, as I said, on my stuff, it was very hard to write anything academically anyway at the time on Brexit. But since then, I mean, in general, because of the fellowship, my profile went up a fair bit. And I was invited to contribute to 2 books from international collaborations. One was on relationship between executive, so governments and parliaments in in Europe, and I was the UK or Brexit person. So I got a book chapter out of that, and something else on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in terms of the institutional setup and what's missing in that. So it's come a lot further down the line for me. But now there's stuff that I can draw on. But as Tony said, it's not that I was using necessarily anything that I discovered on internal sessions. It was more the insight and the context to what I was writing, rather than just focusing very dryly on this parliamentary process. It was more about, well, I was actually there when it was happening. So when the votes were on, for example, on the withdrawal agreement, and I could pick up kind of copies of the transcript of the debate and that kind of thing. So all of that eventually could go into more academic stuff. And also in terms of ref, even if it might be that your department really likes this as a an impact case study, but also it's relevant for the ref environment statement. I mean, who knows what the next ref will look like, but it's also quite helpful for that in terms of the department, which is useful because you need to get your head of department on side to do this in the first place. So thinking a bit strategically about not necessarily selling it to the department, but they certainly get something out of it. It's not only your own personal research career as well. So there are benefits, knock-on benefits like that too, I would say.
And just to briefly add to that, the thing we haven't mentioned yet at all is in order to cover the cost of the fellowship, you need to secure an impact accelerator grants. And so if you've got the support of your head of department and you've got the support of the institution, it's not guaranteed, but it strongly puts, the probability of you being successful, is much higher than in an open competition, and that's grant income. So actually, if you do a fellowship for 6 months or a year or as in 2 years in my case, I mean, that's an external grant that you have won and goes against your name. So it's you might be missing there might be some opportunity costs in other areas, but actually you are, you're not only doing the fellowship, but you're bringing in, technically you're bringing in research income to the department. So that's something else that, it's part of the process, but also in terms of your career development it's a sort of quick way to getting an external grant if you've not had one, or you've been unlucky in the past with grant applications.
Okay, I think we've worked through all the questions now, pre-submitted ones and the ones that have been asked today. I believe Josie wants to come back in now and say a few words.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, everybody. That was it was really interesting, and thanks so much for sharing your experiences with everybody. And just also thank you to the audience for submitting your questions before and during the session. It's been great to kind of have your interaction with this and kind of make sure we're getting the most from our panelists. Thank you. Before we finish, I just wanted to let you know that our next Innovation to Impact session will be taking place in September. The date's to be confirmed, but the topic will be on influencing and understanding policy in the international context. So as soon as we've got a date and some further details, I will circulate those. If you're interested in participating in the series, so if you've got an idea for something, then please do email type@york.ac.uk. So that's type@york.ac.uk. I will circulate some details following the session, as well as the recording of this. Thank you again to our panelists and to Ben, our chair, and to our audience today. And I hope that you are able to join us again in the future for one of our sessions.